The Concordate fleet limped toward Mars, and their victory at Jupiter had cost them dearly, and the alien commanders looked at their losses and wondered if any conquest was worth this price. And they had started with 5,000 ships, and now barely 2,000 remained combat-ready, and another 1,000 were damaged beyond immediate repair, and the rest were debris floating in the dark. And yet they pressed on, because turning back now would mean admitting that primitive humans had defeated the greatest military force in the galaxy. Admiral Hyunwoo watched them come, and his remaining fleet numbered less than 300 ships, and many of those were damaged and running low on ammunition and fuel, and by every tactical measure, Earth had already lost, and the Concordate would reach the planet and establish a blockade and force surrender through siege. And yet Hyunwoo was not afraid, because humanity had one final card to play, and this card had been hidden since before the war. Commander Bora worked frantically at Luna Command, and she coordinated with teams across the solar system, and especially with a facility on Mercury that had been operating in secret for 2 years, and the facility was called Project Starbreak, and only a handful of people knew what it really was. And now the time had come to use it, and she prayed that it would work, because if it failed, then Earth would fall. Scientist Jae-hoon had spent 5 years developing the technology behind Project Starbreak, and he had studied the physics of faster-than-light travel and discovered something the Concordate never knew. And FTL drives created temporary distortions in space-time, and these distortions could be manipulated and amplified and weaponized. And the theory was elegant, and the practical application was terrifying. The weapon worked by using the sun's energy to power a network of satellites that would create a cascading disruption in the local space-time fabric, and any ship within range that had an active FTL drive would find that drive suddenly disabled, and worse, the disruption would create gravitational waves that would tear through the affected area, and the weapon couldn't be used for conquest, because it required months of preparation and a star's power, and it was purely defensive, but in defense it was absolutely devastating. Sujin sat at her station aboard a defense platform orbiting Earth, and she had been a pacifist before the war, and she had protested against military spending and argued for peaceful solutions to conflicts, and then the Concordate voted to invade, and she watched humanity mobilize and saw the casualty reports from Jupiter, and something changed inside her, and she volunteered, and now she operated weapon systems that would kill thousands, and she no longer struggled with the contradiction, and survival trumped philosophy. The Concordate fleet reached Mars, and they expected the remaining human forces to make a final stand, and instead, they found the planet orbit nearly empty, and only a handful of automated defense platforms remained, and the aliens were confused and suspicious, and they sent scouts ahead to search for traps and found nothing, and slowly they advanced, and their commanders wondered if humanity had finally given up. Hyunwoo had positioned his fleet between Mars and Earth, and his ships were battered and scarred, and their crews were exhausted, and he looked at the faces on his bridge and saw determination mixed with resignation, and they all knew this was likely their final battle, and yet no one suggested surrender, and no one spoke of retreat, and they would fight until their ships were destroyed, and then they would fight in escape pods, and if those were destroyed, they would find other ways to resist. Pilot Tae-yang led the remains of Strike Squadron 7 on what might be their last mission, and he had lost half his pilots at Jupiter, and the survivors were flying damaged fighters that had been patched together from multiple wrecks, and they had limited fuel and almost no ammunition, and yet they stayed in formation and waited for orders, and Tae-yang thought about his family on Earth, and everyone's families, and how this battle would determine if those families had a future. The Concordate fleet approached Earth's orbit, and they could see the blue planet hanging in space, and it looked peaceful and beautiful, and completely defenseless, and the alien commanders prepared their final demands and planned their occupation, and they thought about the honor and glory they would receive for conquering the humans and adding Earth to the Concordate, and none of them suspected what was about to happen. Bora received confirmation from Mercury that Project Starbreak was ready, and the satellites were charged and aligned and locked onto the Concordate fleet's position, and the sun's power had been harnessed and focused and directed, and everything was ready, and she looked at the activation key and hesitated for just a moment, and then she thought about the billions of humans counting on her. And she entered the code Jae-hoon, watched his instruments as the weapon activated, and the satellites around the sun began to pulse in perfect synchronization, and they were creating ripples in space-time that built upon each other and amplified and spread outward toward Earth. And the wave front was invisible, but its effects would be catastrophic, and he had spent years creating this weapon, and now in seconds it would prove his theories or fail spectacularly. The disruption field reached Earth's orbit and passed through the human ships harmlessly, because they had been designed with shielding that protected them from the effect. And then the wave front hit the Concordate fleet, and every FTL drive on every alien ship suddenly experienced a catastrophic cascade failure. And the drives didn't just shut down, they tore themselves apart and took chunks of the ships with them, and hundreds of vessels exploded instantly. The gravitational waves came next, and they weren't natural gravity, but twisted, warped space-time that pulled in multiple directions at once. And Concordate ships that had survived the drive failures now found themselves subjected to forces their hulls were never designed to withstand. And metal screamed and buckled and tore, and ships that had existed for decades were ripped apart in seconds. The sky above Earth lit up as if a second sun had been born, and the light was so bright that people on the surface had to shield their eyes, and they watched in awe and terror as the enemy fleet died. And in orbit, Su-Jin watched her instruments show hundreds of enemy contacts disappearing, and she felt no joy in the deaths but only grim satisfaction that Earth would survive. The Concordate fleet that had numbered 2,000 ships was reduced to less than 500 in the span of 3 minutes, and the survivors were scattered across Earth's orbit, and their FTL drives were offline, and their formations were shattered, and many ships were damaged and venting atmosphere, and the alien commanders tried to regroup, but their communications were disrupted, and their command structure was broken. Admiral Hyunwoo saw his moment and ordered the attack, and the human fleet surged forward, and they had been conserving ammunition for this, and now they unleashed everything they had, and the Concordate ships tried to defend, but they were disorganized and damaged and demoralized, and they had never faced this kind of disadvantage, and their training had never prepared them for fighting. While their ships fell apart, around them Taeyang's squadron hit the alien command ship, and they focused all their fire on its bridge section, and the shields were already weakened by the gravitational waves, and the human missiles punched through and detonated inside the ship, and the Concordate fleet commander died along with his entire staff, and the aliens lost what little coordination they had left. Captain Min Seo brought Silent Echo in close to finish off crippled vessels, and it was brutal work, but necessary, and every alien ship that survived was one that might regroup and threaten Earth again. And she tried not to think about the crews she was killing and focused on the mission and on protecting her home. The battle became a rout, and the Concordate survivors began to surrender, and this was unprecedented in their history, and they had no protocols for it and no procedures, and individual ships simply stopped fighting and broadcast their surrender. And Hyunwoo accepted each one and directed them to holding positions and assigned human crews to guard them in the killing. Finally stopped, Bora looked at the tactical display and saw that of the 5,000 ships that had arrived at Seoul, less than 300 remained intact, and the rest were debris or prisoners. And Earth had won, and the cost had been terrible, and humanity had lost 2/3 of its fleet, and tens of thousands of people had died. And yet they had won, and Earth was safe. Hyunwoo broadcast a message to the surviving Concordate forces, and his voice was tired but firm, and he told them that Earth accepted their surrender, and prisoners would be treated well, and wounded would receive medical care, and in time they would be allowed to return home. And then he added a warning, and he said that any species that threatened Earth again would face the same fate, and humanity had shown restraint in this war but would not do so a second time. The Secretary General of the United Earth Council appeared on every screen across the planet and announced the victory, and people poured into the streets in celebration, and there was crying and laughing and strangers hugging each other, and the relief was overwhelming and yet mixed with grief for those who had died, and the celebration was bittersweet. Jae-hoon sat in his laboratory on Mercury and looked at the data from 6 months had passed since the Battle of Seoul, and the galaxy was still reeling from the shock, and the Concordate that had ruled for 3 millennia was fracturing, and species that had been members for centuries were now questioning their loyalty and declaring independence, and the balance of power that had seemed eternal was crumbling. And at the center of this chaos was Earth, and a species that no one had taken seriously until they shattered an invasion fleet. Admiral Hyunwoo stood in the memorial gardens on Luna, and read the names carved into the black stone wall, and there were thousands of names, and each one represented a person who died defending Earth. And he knew many of them personally, and had served with some and commanded others, and the weight of their sacrifice pressed on him every day. And he came here when the burden of command became too heavy, and reminded himself why they fought. The United Earth Council had promoted him again, and he was no longer just an admiral, and now he was the supreme commander of Earth's military and the Council's chief advisor on interstellar affairs. And he didn't want the position but accepted it because someone had to guide humanity through what came next, and he had proven he could make the hard choices, and the galaxy respected strength, even when it feared it. Ambassador Ji-won had returned to diplomatic service, and her job was harder now than before the war, and species that once dismissed her now listened carefully to every word, and they feared that humanity might decide to become conquerors instead of defenders. And every diplomatic meeting was a careful dance of reassurance and subtle threat, and she was exhausted, but determined to show that Earth wanted. Peace Commander Bora worked on rebuilding Earth's military, and the fleet had been devastated in the war, and less than 100 ships remained combat-ready, and the shipyards worked around the clock to build replacements and repair damaged vessels. And Bora designed the new ships with lessons learned from the war, and they were faster and tougher and deadlier than anything humanity had built before. The Concordat had formally surrendered 3 months after the battle, and the treaty negotiations had been tense and complex, and Earth demanded that the Concordat recognize human sovereignty and withdraw all claims to the Sol system and agree to non-aggression pacts, and the aliens had no choice but to accept because they feared what would happen if they refused, and Hyunwoo had made it clear that Earth would not hesitate to use Project Starbreak again, if threatened. But not all species accepted the peace, and the Velkari were one of the Concordat's founding members, and they had lost more ships than any other species in the invasion, and their pride was wounded, and their leaders refused to acknowledge that primitive humans had defeated them fairly, and they began launching raids on human colonies and mining outposts and trying to provoke Earth into a response. The raids killed hundreds of colonists and destroyed infrastructure that had taken years to build, and the United Earth Council debated how to respond, and some called for immediate retaliation, and others urged restraint, and the debate raged for weeks while more humans died and public opinion turned toward war, and Hyunwoo was given command of a strike force and told to end the Velkari threat permanently. Bora presented him with battle plans that would devastate the Velkari homeworld, and she had analyzed their defenses and found weaknesses and mapped out an attack that would destroy their military capability and force unconditional surrender, and the plans were elegant and brutal and absolutely effective, and Hyunwoo studied them and then put them aside and said he had another idea. Pilot Tai Yang had been promoted to squadron commander, and he trained new pilots in the tactics that won the war, and he taught them about pack hunting and ambush techniques and the importance of adaptation and flexibility. And the young pilots looked at him with awe because he was a hero who had fought at Jupiter and survived, and he tried to teach them that war was not glorious but necessary, and survival mattered more than honor. Scientist Jae-hoon continued his research, and he worked on improvements to Project Starbreak and ways to defend against it if other species tried to copy the technology, and he also worked on peaceful applications of the same physics, and his goal was to make Earth so technologically advanced that no one would dare attack again. And every breakthrough brought humanity closer to that goal. Captain Min Seo commanded a new generation of stealth ships, and she trained crews in special operations, and her ships patrolled the borders of human space and watched for threats. And several times they detected Velkari scout ships preparing for raids, and Min Seo's people eliminated them before they could attack. And she reported these incidents to Hyunwoo, but he ordered her to keep them quiet because he didn't want to escalate the conflict yet. The Velkari leadership made a mistake, and they announced publicly that they would continue raiding human colonies until Earth acknowledged Concordat superiority and submitted to their authority. And it was a propaganda statement meant to restore Velkari pride, and instead it gave Hyunwoo the opening he needed, and he ordered his strike force to mobilize, and the fleet moved toward Velkari space, and the galaxy watched and wondered if humanity would show mercy or vengeance. Ambassador Young-mi was a Velkari who had served in the Concordat diplomatic corps, and she had voted against the invasion of Earth. and warned her people that humans were dangerous, and after the war she resigned in protest of her government's continued aggression, and she had been living in exile and advocating for peace. And when Hyunwoo's fleet approached Valkyrie space, she sent him a message and begged him to show restraint. Hyunwoo's fleet reached the Valkyrie border, and the aliens scrambled their remaining military forces and prepared for an attack that would destroy their homeworld and civilian populations. Evacuated to shelters and ships fled to deep space, and the Valkyrie leaders broadcast defiant messages, but their voices shook with fear because they knew what human weapons could do. The human fleet stopped at the border, and Hyunwoo broadcast a message, and it was not to the Valkyrie government but to their people. And he showed them footage of Earth and images of human cities and families and children playing in parks. And then he showed them footage of the colonies the Valkyrie had raided and the bodies of humans who had died, and the destruction that accomplished nothing. Hyunwoo spoke directly to the Valkyrie population and told them that humanity had not wanted war and had tried to join the Concordat peacefully. And it was the Concordat that voted for invasion and humanity, that was forced to defend itself. And he said that Earth could destroy the Valkyrie homeworld right now, and no one in the galaxy would stop them, because the Valkyrie had broken the peace treaty. First, then he did something no one expected, and he offered peace, and not conquest or punishment but genuine peace. And he said that humans understood pride and the desire to save face after defeat, and Earth was willing to help the Valkyrie rebuild their military as a defensive force and establish trade relationships and cultural exchanges. And all the Valkyrie had to do was stop the raids and acknowledge that the war was over. The Valkyrie government rejected the offer immediately and called it a trick and ordered their military to attack the human fleet. And Hyunwoo had expected this, and he waited and let the Valkyrie ships approach, and then his forces disabled them without destroying them, and captured the vessels intact, and took the crews prisoner and treated them well and broadcast the whole thing across Valkyrie space. Youngmi saw what Hyunwoo was doing, and she contacted resistance groups within Valkyrie society and people who were tired of the government's pride costing them lives and resources, and she organized protests and demonstrations, and slowly the Valkyrie population turned against their leaders and demanded they accept Earth's peace offer. The Valkyrie government fell in a bloodless coup, and new leaders took power, and their first act was to contact Hyunwoo and accept his terms and apologize for the raids and ask for forgiveness. And Hyunwoo granted it and ordered his fleet to withdraw, and Young Mi returned home as part of the new government and became the first alien to advocate for genuine friendship with humanity. The galaxy watched this unfold with amazement, and fear turned to respect, and species that had been preparing to defend against human aggression instead began sending diplomatic missions and trade proposals and requests for defensive alliances, and Ambassador Ji-won found herself overwhelmed with opportunities, and the United Earth Council had to hire thousands of new diplomats to handle the flood of interest. 3 species that had voted against the invasion now became Earth's closest allies, and they shared technology and intelligence and cultural exchanges, and humans learned from them, and they learned from humans, and genuine friendships formed between species that had never trusted each other before, and the foundation of something new began to take shape. The Concordat officially dissolved 6 months after the Battle of Seoul, and it had existed for 3,000 years, but could not survive the loss of faith that followed humanity's victory, and in its place a new organization formed, and the Interstellar Council that was based on cooperation rather. Commander Taemin stood on the bridge of the GCS Meridian and stared at the view screen showing empty space, where Earth should have been broadcasting signals, and 3 months of silence from humanity weighed heavy on his mind like a stone pressing down on his chest, because something was very wrong with this entire situation, and he knew it in his bones. Even though the Council kept telling him that humans had simply given up and accepted their fate, after the ultimatum was delivered 6 months, ego demanding they surrender their planet's special gravitational zones for resource harvesting, or face complete isolation from galactic trade and protection. But Taemin had studied human history during his journey to their solar system, and nothing he read suggested these beings would simply roll over and die quietly, without making noise or causing trouble first, since their entire existence seemed to be built on stubborn refusal to accept defeat. even when logic said they should just surrender and save themselves the pain of fighting. The Meridian was the largest ship in the Galactic Council fleet and carried over 2,000 crew members, from 15 different species, all working together under the banner of galactic unity and progress. And Taemin had been chosen to command this mission because of his perfect record of handling difficult situations with primitive species who needed to be brought into line with Council regulations and standards. But as they crossed into the solar system past the orbit of Neptune, he felt an uncomfortable sensation crawling up his spine, like insects marching in formation toward his brain, telling him that maybe this time was different from all the other times he had bullied smaller civilizations into compliance with overwhelming shows of force and technological superiority. Dr. Hana sat at her science station reviewing data streams that made no sense whatsoever, because 3 months ago, every human colony on Mars and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn had simply gone dark all at once, like someone flipped a switch and turned off all their lights and communications equipment simultaneously. And she had argued with the Council leadership for weeks, trying to convince them that humans were not the type of species to give up so easily based on her years of studying their culture and psychological profiles. But nobody listened to her warnings because she was just one xenobiologist among thousands. And what did she know compared to the military strategists and political leaders who had managed galactic affairs for millennia, before humans even discovered fire and invented the wheel? The view screen flickered and Taemin leaned forward in his command chair as his pilot Hyunwoo adjusted the sensors, trying to get a clear reading on Earth's orbital space. And what they saw made everyone on the bridge fall silent, because floating in neat geometric patterns around the planet were the shattered remains of 17 Council reconnaissance drones that had been sent ahead to monitor human activity and report back on their compliance with the ultimatum. But instead of finding compliant humans waving white flags, they found destruction and debris spinning slowly in the vacuum of space like a graveyard of metal and broken technology, mocking their assumption that this would be an easy mission requiring minimal effort and no real danger to Council forces. Taemin ordered Hyunwoo to run a full-spectrum analysis on the debris field, and what came back made his blood run cold in his veins because the drones had not been destroyed by conventional weapons or explosions, but rather by precise surgical strikes that targeted their power cores and communication arrays with such accuracy that it suggested an understanding of Council technology that humans were not supposed to possess, according to all the intelligence reports and assessment files he had read during the journey. And Dr. Hana pulled up the drone logs showing that each one had been functioning perfectly until exactly 93 days ago, when something hit them so fast and so accurately that their sensors never even registered what killed them, before they went permanently offline forever. The communications officer suddenly shouted that she was receiving a transmission from Earth, and everyone turned to look at her as she played the audio through the bridge speakers. And what they heard was static mixed with fragments of a human voice speaking slowly and deliberately, with pauses between each word, like someone trying to make sure every syllable was understood perfectly clear. You were warned that we would not surrender our home without a fight, and you ignored those warnings because you thought we were weak and primitive and unable to resist your superior technology and military might. But you were wrong about us, and now you will pay the price for your arrogance and your attempt to take what was never yours to claim in the first place. The transmission cut off abruptly, and Taemin ordered the communications officer to try establishing a proper channel with Earth's government so they could open negotiations and find out what had happened to the human population. But every attempt to make contact was met with silence or strange electromagnetic interference that seemed to actively push back against their scanning beams and communication lasers, like an invisible wall built around the entire planet to keep outsiders away from whatever secrets humanity was hiding down there on the surface. Agent Kyung-soo appeared on the bridge from the intelligence section and handed Taemin a data pad showing analysis of the transmission. And according to the linguistic experts and code breakers who had examined every microsecond of the audio file, the message was not actually a communication meant to convey information, but rather a countdown timer disguised as a warning. And nobody could figure out what the countdown was measuring or when it would reach zero, because humans had encrypted it using mathematics that did not match any known galactic standard or pattern that Council computers could recognize or decode. Dr. Hana stood up from her station and walked over to Taemin with her own datapad showing historical records of human behavior during times of existential crisis. and she pointed out that every single time in their recorded history, when humanity faced extinction or conquest by a more powerful enemy, they responded not with surrender, but with innovation and adaptation, and stubborn refusal to accept their fate. And she reminded him that humans had gone from primitive chemical rockets to functional fusion drives in less than 200 years, which was unprecedented speed for technological development among species that had not received help from more advanced civilizations. Taman made a decision and ordered the Meridian to hold position at the edge of Earth's orbital space, while he sent a message back to Council High Command explaining the situation and requesting additional support and guidance. But even as he gave the order, he knew deep in his gut that something had changed in the balance of power between the Council and humanity. And whatever that change was, it would not favor the Council's plans to strip Earth of its resources and add another conquered species to their long list of subjugated civilizations. On Earth's surface far below the orbiting Meridian, Captain Deho stood in an underground command center surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of every Council ship in the solar system, and beside him Engineer Yuna monitored the planetary defense grid that humanity had spent the last 5 years building in secret while pretending to be primitive and helpless and unaware of the true extent of galactic civilization's plans for their world. And Deho smiled grimly as he activated the next phase of Protocol Reckoning, knowing that the Council was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating human determination and ingenuity when survival was at stake. The response from Council High Command came through 18 hours later, and Taman read the orders with growing unease, because instead of sending reinforcements or allowing time for proper reconnaissance, the Council demanded immediate action and insisted he land forces on Earth's surface to investigate the human cities and determine what had happened to the population of 9 billion people who could not simply vanish into thin air without leaving traces behind. And the orders specifically stated that failure to secure Earth's gravitational anomaly zones within 1 standard week would result in his removal from command and possible court-martial for incompetence, which seemed excessive considering nobody really understood what they were dealing with down on that silent blue planet. Hyunwoo prepared the landing shuttles while Taman selected the team members who would accompany the first wave, and he made sure to include Dr. Hana because her expertise in human psychology might prove valuable if they encountered any survivors hiding in the abandoned cities. And he also brought Agent Kyung-soo despite his reservations about the intelligence operative's tendency to see conspiracies and threats everywhere he looked, because maybe paranoia was exactly what they needed right now given how strange everything had become since entering this cursed solar system. Shuttles launched from the Meridian's hangar bay and descended through Earth's atmosphere, encountering no resistance from planetary defense systems or anti-aircraft weapons, and Taman found that lack of opposition more disturbing than if they had been shot at, because it suggested humans wanted them to land and walk into whatever trap had been prepared. But he kept those thoughts to himself and watched through the viewport as they dropped below the clouds, and the landscape of Earth revealed itself in all its varied beauty, with oceans and mountains and forests spreading out beneath them like a painting. They landed in what human records identified as Seoul, a major population center that should have held over 20 million inhabitants based on pre-silent census data. And when the shuttle ramps lowered and Taman led his team out onto the street, he felt his skin prickle with awareness, because the city was completely intact, with buildings standing tall and vehicles parked neatly along the roads and even plants growing in window boxes. But there was not a single living person anywhere in sight, and no bodies or signs of struggle or evidence of evacuation. Just emptiness and silence, broken only by the wind whistling between the skyscrapers. Dr. Hana pulled out her scanner and took readings of the ambient environment, looking for clues about where the humans had gone. And her equipment showed that the air was clean, and the buildings had power running through them, and the water systems were still functioning normally, which meant the infrastructure had been maintained right up until everyone disappeared. And she walked into a nearby apartment building with Taman following close behind, while Kyung-soo stayed outside coordinating with the other landing teams scattered across the planet's surface. Inside the apartment, they found furniture arranged as if people had just stepped out for a moment, intending to return shortly, and there were meals sitting on tables that had long since rotted and spoiled, and personal items scattered around suggesting normal life had been happening right up until the moment it stopped. And Dr. Hana picked up a child's toy from the floor and turned it over in her hands while trying to understand what could cause an entire species to abandon their home so completely and so quickly. Tamino, as communicator chirped, and he answered to hear one of his officers reporting that the landing team in New York had discovered something important. And when he asked what it was, the officer's voice shook slightly as she explained that beneath the city, they had found entrance points to massive underground tunnels that seemed to stretch for kilometers in every direction, forming a network that possibly connected the entire planet. And Taman ordered all teams to mark the tunnel locations but not to enter them until he could assess the situation personally. Scientist Minji, back aboard the Meridian, was analyzing the electromagnetic pulses coming from Earth's surface, and she made a discovery that changed everything, because the pulses were not random interference as initially assumed, but rather carefully constructed signals carrying massive amounts of encrypted data. And when she ran the patterns through the ship's computer looking for matches to known communication protocols, the system identified elements of Council military encryption mixed with mathematical formulas that appeared to be of human origin, which should have been impossible since humans were not supposed to understand Council technology well enough to reverse engineer it. Hyun-woo was flying reconnaissance patterns over the Pacific Ocean when his shuttle's systems suddenly went haywire and every warning alarm started screaming at once. And before he could react, something rose up from the water beneath him, moving faster than his sensors could track, and it hit his shuttle with a kinetic impact that sent him spinning out of control toward the ocean surface while he fought desperately with the controls trying to keep his craft airborne. The other pilots saw what happened and broke formation, attempting to help Hyun-woo. But more objects launched from hidden positions all around them, and within 30 seconds half the reconnaissance flight had been destroyed by weapons that appeared out of nowhere and struck with devastating accuracy before vanishing back into concealment. And Hyun-woo managed to crash land his damaged shuttle on a small island and climbed out just in time to see automated defense turrets rising from beneath the sand and targeting him with weapons that hummed. With barely restrained power back in Seoul, Taman received the emergency reports and immediately ordered all forces to retreat back to the landing zones. But before they could reach their shuttles, the ground beneath the city began to shake and massive metal structures emerged from underground, rising up through the streets and positioning themselves around the landing craft like predators surrounding prey. And Dr. Hana recognized the technology as similar to Council railgun emplacements, but modified in ways that made them more efficient and more deadly than anything the Council currently deployed. Team tried to contact the Meridian, but found that communications were being jammed by the same electromagnetic interference that had been plaguing them since arrival, and he gathered his team together and made the decision to head for one of the underground tunnel entrances, because staying on the surface was clearly suicide. And as they ran through the empty streets toward the nearest tunnel access point, he could hear the defense turrets powering up behind them, preparing to fire. They reached the tunnel entrance and descended into darkness lit only by their helmet lamps, and the passage stretched ahead of them, smooth and clearly constructed with advanced engineering techniques. And along the walls were markings in human languages mixed with what looked like technical schematics for equipment Taman did not recognize. And Dr. Hana translated some of the text, and her face went pale as she read aloud. Phase 3 complete. All civilians evacuated to designated safe zones. Defense grid activation in 72 hours. May our sacrifice buy Earth the freedom we could not win through peace. Agent Kyung-soo found a control panel embedded in the tunnel wall and managed to bypass its security using Council override codes. And when he accessed the system logs, what he discovered made him curse in 3 different languages, because the logs showed that humans had been planning this scenario for over 5 years. And during that time they had built not just one underground city, but hundreds of them connected by tunnels that crisscrossed beneath every continent. And they had done it all while maintaining normal surface life and pretending to be ignorant of the Council's true intentions on the Meridian. Minji finally cracked part of the encryption on the electromagnetic signals, and what she found was a countdown timer showing 18 days remaining until something the humans called Final Protocol would activate. And beneath the timer was a message in over 600 languages, including all the major Council dialects, and the message repeated the same words over and over. You will pay for what you tried to take. Taman and his team went deeper into the tunnels, following the passage for what felt like hours until they emerged into an enormous underground chamber that stretched so far in every direction that their lights could not reach the walls. And in the center of the chamber was a massive cylindrical structure covered in cables and conduits that pulsed with blue light, and Dr. Hana's scanner went crazy, trying to analyze the energy readings coming from the device. Suddenly, holographic projectors activated around them, and a human figure appeared standing before them wearing what looked like a military uniform, and the figure spoke with a calm voice that held no anger or fear. "Welcome to Earth, representatives of the Galactic Council. My name is Captain Deho, and I am the commanding officer of humanity's defense forces, and I am here to inform you that your time of taking whatever you want from weaker species is over, because we have built something you cannot defeat or destroy or overcome through force, and soon you will understand the price of your arrogance." Agent Kyung-soo ran through the underground tunnels with his weapon drawn, and his mind racing through possibilities for how to disable the human network. And he had studied terrorist tactics and insurgent strategies throughout his career, which taught him that even the most sophisticated systems had vulnerable points that could be exploited by someone willing to take extreme action. And he believed that if he could reach the central hub and plant explosives on the neural interface connections, he might be able to sever the link between human minds and the defense grid before anyone could stop him. The tunnels branched in multiple directions, but Kyung-soo followed the thickest power conduits because he knew they would lead to whatever machinery was keeping 9 billion humans alive in their stasis pods. And as he moved deeper underground, the walls changed from simple concrete to more advanced materials that looked biological in nature, and he realized with growing unease that the humans had not just built a computer network, but had created something that blurred the line between technology and living organism. Behind him in the first chamber, Taemin demanded that Daeho's hologram stop Kyung-soo before he did something catastrophic. But the captain's image remained calm and replied, "Let him go, Commander, because he needs to see with his own eyes what we have created and understand why it cannot be destroyed by conventional means. And perhaps when he reaches the central hub, he will finally grasp the full scope of what humanity has accomplished." Dr. Hana was analyzing the network architecture using her portable scanner, and what she discovered made her gasp because the human consciousness network was not contained in computer servers or data storage, but rather existed as a living quantum field that connected every human brain in the stasis pods through electromagnetic resonance, and destroying the physical infrastructure would not stop the network, but would instead trap all those minds in limbo between life and death, with no way to return them to their bodies. On the Meridian, Hyunwoo sat with Soo-jin in the medical bay, while technicians examined her to make sure she was not carrying any biological weapons or technological surveillance devices. And during the examination, they talked about their respective species, and she explained that humans had never wanted conflict with the Council, but felt they had no choice after diplomatic attempts were ignored. "We sent ambassadors and scientists and cultural representatives to your worlds for decades, and we tried to show you that we could be valuable partners in galactic civilization, but the Council only saw us as a source of resources to be extracted. And when you issued the ultimatum demanding our gravitational zones, we knew that cooperation was never really an option for species you consider beneath you." Hyunwoo listened and felt shame burning in his chest because he had participated in 3 previous Council operations against primitive species, and in each case he had justified his actions by believing the official narrative that the Council was bringing progress and civilization to backwards worlds. But Soo-jin's words made him question everything he thought he knew about his government's motives and methods. Minji received a priority transmission from Council High Command, and when she decoded the message, her blood went cold because the leadership had decided that Earth represented an unacceptable threat to galactic stability, and they were ordering the fleet to deploy planetary destruction weapons, regardless of casualties or consequences. And the transmission explicitly stated that losing one war fleet was preferable to allowing humans to maintain control over Council technology. Immediately forwarded the message to Taemin, who was still underground, and when he received it, he understood that his time for negotiation had just run out because the Council would rather destroy Earth than admit they had been outmaneuvered by a supposedly primitive species. Kyung-soo reached the central hub after nearly an hour of running through progressively stranger tunnels that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and when he emerged into the final chamber, he stopped dead and stared at what lay before him because the hub was not a machine in any traditional sense, but rather an enormous sphere of crystalline material, suspended in the center of a chamber that stretched upward for what looked like kilometers, and covering every surface of the sphere were billions of tiny lights, each one representing a human mind connected to the network. Standing beside the sphere waiting for him was Captain Deho in physical form, not holographic projection, and the captain looked tired and worn, like someone who had not slept properly in months. "Welcome, Agent Kyung-soo. I have been waiting for someone like you to reach this place because I knew the Council would send assassins and saboteurs when they realized they could not win through conventional warfare." Kyung-soo aimed his weapon at Deho and demanded that he deactivate the network immediately or face execution. But the captain merely shook his head sadly. "Shoot me if you wish, Agent. But it will change nothing because I am not the one controlling the network. I am merely one voice among 9 billion, and my death would be noticed by the system but would not stop it from functioning." At that moment, Engineer Yuna appeared from a side passage and walked toward them carrying a device that Kyung-soo recognized as a Council neural disruptor capable of frying every electronic system within a 100-meter radius. "Captain Deho, I am sorry, but I cannot let him destroy what we have built. And I will use this disruptor to stop him if necessary, even though it means I will die when the electromagnetic pulse hits my cybernetic implants." Kyung-soo realized he was outmaneuvered, and he lowered his weapon slightly while trying to think of another approach. "You are all insane. You have trapped your entire species in a machine that could kill them all if anything goes wrong. And you call this freedom, but it looks like a prison to me." Deho walked closer to Kyung-soo and spoke with a voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. "You are right that this is not the future we wanted for humanity. And yes, there is a possibility that something could go wrong, and we could lose everyone in the network. But when the Council gave us the choice between certain conquest and uncertain survival, we chose to fight even if fighting meant risking everything. Because at least this way we have a chance to remain ourselves instead of becoming subjects of your empire." On the Meridian, Taemin made his own impossible choice, and he activated the command override that every Council ship captain swore they would never use, which was the authority to refuse direct orders from high command if those orders would result in genocide or crimes against sentient species, and he broadcast a message to the entire fleet explaining that he would not participate in the destruction of Earth, and that any ship attempting to fire on the planet would be considered a hostile target and engaged accordingly. Half the fleet commanders supported his decision, but the other half declared him a traitor and began powering up their weapon systems. And within minutes, Council ships were targeting each other while the human defense network watched and waited. Yuna saw what was happening through her neural link to the network, and she realized this was the moment they had planned for. And she turned to Deho. "Captain, if we act now while the Council fleet is divided, we can disable their weapons permanently and force them to accept peace terms. But doing so will reveal the full extent of our capabilities, and there will be no going back." Deho nodded and closed his eyes. And Kyung-soo watched in horror as every light on the crystalline sphere began to pulse in perfect synchronization, and he felt a wave of energy wash over him that made his teeth ache and his vision blur throughout the solar system. Every Council ship suddenly went dark as their power cores were shut down by commands that came from their own computers, and the human network demonstrated its total dominance over Council technology by taking control of everything from life support systems to weapons targeting. And then just as suddenly everything came back online, but now with human code embedded so deeply in the operating systems that removing it would require rebuilding every ship from scratch. A new message appeared on every Council view screen in 9 billion different voices speaking as one. "You came to our world with weapons and demands. You tried to take our home because you believed we were too weak to stop you. But you were wrong about humanity. And now you will accept our terms for peace, or we will dismantle your entire civilization one system at a time, until nothing remains but the memory of your arrogance." Taemin received a private communication from Deho asking him to return to the underground hub for final negotiations. And when he arrived with Dr. Hana and Hyunwoo, they found Yuna lying on the floor bleeding from her nose and ears. And Deho explained that she had sacrificed herself to stop Kyung-soo from destroying the disruptor device by absorbing its full discharge into her own body. Dr. Hana tried to save Yuna, but the damage was too extensive and the engineer died with a smile on her face. knowing she had protected humanity's last hope for freedom.